Daniel Marsh had been staring at the same ceiling in his apartment in Austin, Texas for about 20 minutes when he finally reached over to the nightstand and picked up the book his older brother had left behind after Thanksgiving. His brother Jake worked at a venture capital firm in San Francisco and had the annoying habit of leaving books around like little pieces of unsolicited advice. This one was called 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel. Daniel had been meaning to read it for 3 weeks. It was a Tuesday night in February, he had nothing pressing, and his startup idea, a platform for local food truck vendors to manage orders and logistics, had been sitting in a Google Doc untouched for 2 months. He figured he had nothing to lose. He made a cup of coffee, sat down on his couch, and opened the first page. By the time he reached the end of the introduction, something had already shifted slightly in the way he was thinking. Thiel opened with a question he had apparently asked in every interview he ever conducted at his companies. What important truth do very few people agree with you on? Daniel set the book on his knee and sat with that for a moment. He tried to answer it honestly. Nothing came immediately. That bothered him more than he expected. The question was not trivia. Thiel was using it to set up something much larger. His central argument was about the nature of progress itself, and it started with a distinction so clean it felt almost too simple. There are 2 kinds of progress, Thiel wrote. You can take something that exists and make more copies of it, improving it slightly along the way. Or you can create something that did not exist before. The first kind he called going from 1 to n, horizontal progress, spreading what already works. The second kind he called going from 0 to 1, vertical progress, building something genuinely new. Most of the world runs on the first kind. The rarest and most valuable work in the world comes from the second. Daniel thought about his food truck platform. Someone in Portland had already built something like it. Someone in Denver too, probably. He had told himself his version would be cleaner, faster, better designed. Going from 1 to n, he now realized with some discomfort. He had not thought about what it would mean to go from 0 to 1. He kept reading. The next section of the book hit Daniel harder than he anticipated, because it was about competition, and Daniel had spent most of his adult life believing that competition was the proof of a healthy market. If other people were doing something similar, that meant there was demand. That was the logic everyone around him seemed to operate on. Find a market with proven demand, and find a way to compete inside it. He had heard this from professors at the University of Texas Business School. He had heard it from podcasts. He had heard it from mentors at the small accelerator program he had briefly attended in South Congress. Thiel dismantled this logic with a patience that felt almost gentle, and then left the rubble sitting there for the reader to look at. His argument was that competition is not a sign of opportunity. It is a sign of a crowded space where everyone is fighting over the same shrinking margins. Think about the restaurant business, Thiel wrote. Americans spend enormous amounts of money on food every year. But the average restaurant in this country operates on margins so thin that most of them close within 5 years. The market is massive. The competition is brutal. And the result is that almost no one in the restaurant industry makes real money, because the moment something works, 50 other people copy it. The market is big and the rewards are tiny, spread across too many players fighting over the same customers. Now think about a company like Google, Thiel continued. Google captures the overwhelming majority of the search advertising market. It makes enormous profits. Its margins are not thin. And why? Because it does not have meaningful competition in its core business. It owns the category. It went from 0 to 1 in a space it essentially defined, and the result is a business that prints money while the restaurant down the street prays it gets through the weekend. Daniel put the book down for a moment and walked to the kitchen to refill his coffee. He stood at the counter thinking about what he had just read. The food truck platform. There were already players in that space, which meant he was entering a competition he had not truly examined. Even if his version was better, what was better worth if everyone was competing to be better in the same direction? He came back to the couch and kept reading. Thiel had a word for what he was describing, monopoly. But he was careful to separate the word from its common meaning. He was not talking about the illegal, predatory kind of monopoly that crushes competitors through underhanded means. He was talking about a company so good at what it does, so uniquely positioned, so genuinely different from everything else in its space, that it effectively operates without competition. Google did not become a monopoly by cheating. It became a monopoly by building something so much better than what existed that it rendered the alternatives irrelevant. That, Thiel argued, is the actual goal worth pursuing. not to compete better. To build something so different that competition becomes beside the point. The businesses that generate the most value in the world are not the ones fighting hardest in crowded markets. They are the ones that created their own categories and then dominated them. Daniel had a friend named Rachel who ran a boutique marketing agency out of a co-working space in the Domain area of Austin. She was sharp, hardworking, and perpetually exhausted. They grabbed lunch the following Saturday at a taco place on North Loop, and Daniel found himself describing what he had been reading in a way that surprised even him. He told her about Thiel's competition trap. Rachel stirred her iced tea and nodded slowly. "I've been competing," she said, almost to herself. "I compete with 17 other agencies in this city for the same clients. I compete on price. I compete on turnaround time. I compete on service packages." She paused. "I have never once asked myself if there was a way to stop competing entirely." That, Daniel told her, was exactly what the book was pushing toward. And the answer Thiel offered was not to find a less crowded market to compete in. It was to build something genuinely different, something so specifically suited to a particular problem that the usual comparisons stopped applying. A monopoly of one, built on real value rather than market manipulation. Rachel looked thoughtful. What would that even look like for a marketing agency? Daniel did not have an answer for her yet. He was still working through the book himself. But the question felt like the right one, and that was a start. The section that most unsettled Daniel's comfortable assumptions was Thiel's treatment of the future. Specifically, the way most people relate to it. Thiel described 4 possible orientations toward the future. You could be optimistic and definite, meaning you believe the future will be good and you have a specific plan for making it so. You could be optimistic and indefinite, meaning you believe things will generally improve, but you have no particular plan for how. You could be pessimistic and definite, believing things will get worse and preparing specifically for that deterioration. Or you could be pessimistic and indefinite, believing things will generally decline with no clear response. Most Americans right now, Thiel argued, fall into the second category. Optimistic but indefinite. They believe in progress. They believe the future will be better than the present. But they do not have a plan. They are waiting for things to improve through some general mechanism they trust, but cannot describe. And this orientation, which feels positive on the surface, is actually one of the most dangerous postures a person can take, because it outsources the future to chance rather than design. The definite optimist is different. The definite optimist looks at the future and says something specific is possible, and here is how I intend to make it happen. This kind of person makes plans. Not vague resolutions, not general ambitions, but specific, actionable designs for a particular outcome. Thiel pointed to the engineers who built the Golden Gate Bridge, the scientists who developed the polio vaccine, the people behind the Apollo program. They did not simply hope the future would contain these things. They decided the future would contain them, and then built the steps that led there. Daniel thought about his own relationship with the future. He had a Google Doc with a startup idea in it. He believed it could work someday. He had been hoping clarity would arrive. He had not made a plan. He sat with the discomfort of that recognition for a while before turning the page. Thiel spent several chapters on startups specifically, and Daniel read these sections with a particular kind of attention because they felt the most directly applicable to where he was in his life. The first thing Thiel established was that the founding team of any startup is not just a practical arrangement. It is more like a marriage. The people you begin with will shape everything that follows. The culture, the decisions, the defaults, the way conflict gets handled, the speed at which trust breaks or holds. He was not being romantic about this. He was being precise. Most startups that fail do not fail because the idea was wrong. They fail because the people inside them could not maintain the alignment and trust necessary to execute through difficulty. Choosing your co-founders deserves at least as much seriousness as choosing your spouse, and most people give it a fraction of that thought. Daniel had been vaguely thinking about asking a friend from college to work on the food truck platform with him. They got along well. They had a good time at happy hours. Daniel realized, reading this section, that he had essentially no idea whether this friend could handle a high-stakes disagreement, how he responded to failure, what he truly valued, or whether his long-term vision for his own life was compatible with the demands of building a company. He had been about to propose a marriage based on the fact that they had a good time at happy hours. He put a sticky note on that page. The second thing that struck him was Thiel's discussion of distribution, which echoed something he had read in the opening chapters, but now landed with greater force. Engineers and builders, Thiel observed, tend to believe that if they create something genuinely good, the world will find it. This belief is almost always wrong, and it has killed more promising companies than bad products have. Sales, the actual work of getting your product in front of the right people, building trust, communicating value in a way that moves people to act, is not a side function that someone else handles after the real work is done. It is central to whether the real work ever reaches anyone. The best salespeople, Thiel wrote, are the ones you do not recognize as salespeople. The most effective distribution does not look like distribution. It looks like storytelling, like relationship, like the quiet accumulation of credibility. But it has to be intentional. It has to be designed. The company that believes its product will market itself is the company that is about to learn a very expensive lesson. Daniel thought about every founder he had ever heard pitch at Austin startup events. Most of them talked almost exclusively about their product. How it worked, what it did, how it was better than the alternative. Almost none of them talked with equal depth about how they were going to reach people, earn trust, and build the kind of presence that actually moves markets. The product was the whole show. Distribution was the thing they would figure out later. Thiel was saying that later almost always arrives too late. There was a chapter near the middle of the book that Daniel had to read twice, because the first time through it felt abstract, and the second time it felt like someone had turned a light on in a room he had been navigating in the dark. Thiel was talking about secrets. His argument was deceptively simple. The world still contains an enormous number of things that are true, but not yet widely understood or accepted. Things that most people either have not noticed, have noticed and dismissed, or have noticed and been too afraid to act on. He called these secrets, not in the conspiratorial sense, but in the sense of hidden truths sitting in plain view, waiting for someone with the clarity and courage to take them seriously. The greatest companies in history, Thiel wrote, were built on secrets. Not on obvious insights that everyone had already agreed upon, but on something the founder understood that the rest of the world had not yet caught up to. The people who started Airbnb understood something about trust and the sharing economy that the hotel industry had missed entirely. The people who built PayPal understood something about digital payments that the traditional banking system had not yet grasped. These were not random guesses. They were specific, reasoned beliefs about how the world worked that turned out to be correct precisely because most people had not yet arrived at the same conclusion. Thiel pressed the reader with a direct challenge. What do you believe that most people around you would disagree with? What do you understand about the world, about a specific market, a specific human behavior, a specific gap between what exists and what is needed, that has not yet become common knowledge? This was the same question from the opening pages, but now Daniel understood its full weight. It was not a personality test or a clever icebreaker. It was the actual question that determined whether a company had a reason to exist. A business built on a conventional insight, on a truth that everyone already agrees with, has no real competitive advantage because everyone else who agrees with that truth can pursue the same opportunity with equal standing. A business built on a genuine secret, a specific, defensible, true belief that most of the market has not yet recognized, has a head start that cannot be easily replicated because you cannot copy an insight you do not have. Daniel spent a long time thinking about what he genuinely believed about the food truck industry, about local commerce, about the way small vendors in cities like Austin were underserved by existing tools. Not what he had assumed to be true, because it seemed reasonable. What he actually knew from direct observation, that was not yet reflected in any existing product. He was not sure yet, but for the first time he was asking the right question. The final chapters of the book dealt with something Thiel called the power law, and it reframed the way Daniel thought about decisions in a way that felt almost physical in its impact. The power law is a mathematical principle, but Thiel applied it to the real world of investing and building with a directness that made the math feel urgent. In a normal distribution, what most people think of as a bell curve, outcomes cluster around an average. Most things are about as good or as bad as each other, with a few outliers on either end. But in the world of startups and innovation, the distribution is not normal. A small number of outcomes account for the overwhelming majority of the total value created. The best investment in a portfolio does not just outperform the others slightly. It outperforms all of them combined. The best company in a category does not just edge out the competition. It captures a disproportionate share of the entire market's value. What this means practically is that the question of what you choose to work on matters far more than how hard you work at it. A person who dedicates 10 years of intense effort to the wrong category, the kind of crowded, margin-thin, going from one-to-end category Thiel had described early in the book, will produce less value than a person who spends 2 years on a genuinely differentiated idea in a space positioned for exponential growth. The effort might be identical. The outcomes will not be close. This felt both liberating and sobering to Daniel at the same time. Liberating because it suggested that the quality of your thinking about what to pursue mattered enormously, not just your willingness to grind. Sobering because it meant that many of the things he had been giving his time and attention to, ideas that felt productive, frameworks that felt reasonable, comparisons that felt useful, were operating inside a flawed model of how the world actually distributed rewards. He closed the book somewhere around midnight, set it on the coffee table, and looked at the wall for a while. He was not sure yet what the 0-to-1 version of his idea looked like. He was not sure what secret he was building on or what monopoly position he was working toward. But he had asked a better set of questions than he had started the evening with, and that, he was beginning to understand, was how most real progress began. Not with a plan fully formed, but with a question honest enough to be worth following wherever it led. He picked up his phone and texted his brother Jake. "Finally read it," he typed. "We need to talk." He set the phone down and started writing notes.